All right, so this is the torso model. The first feature that I want to point out is part of the digestive system. This salivary gland lies in the cheek, and this is called the parotid gland. And we have another one. This is the submandibular gland, called the submandibular because it is under the mandible. You have a third salivary gland that is not shown in this particular model, and that is the sublingual gland. Sublingual, as you might imagine, would be under the tongue. Saliva does a couple of different things in the body. It does have amylase, which is an enzyme that begins to break down sugars, carbohydrates. But in addition to that, we actually need the saliva to moisten our food into a substance that we call a bolus. And a bolus is a moistened portion of food. This here is the hyoid bone. That's H-Y-O-I-D, hyoid. Now the hyoid bone is the only unarticulated bone in the body. Now, even the patella, which is a sesamoid bone embedded in a tendon, still makes contact with the femur. And as you bend your knee and straighten your knee, the patella actually slides across the surface of the femur. This doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body, interestingly. And what this bone does is this assists in swallowing and vocalization more than anything else. So now I'm going to start to take this apart a little bit. So now as we kind of pull some things away, here and here on both sides, that is actually the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland. This structure in the front with these rings is the trachea. The trachea. These rings are the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. And this portion from here to here is all considered the larynx. The larynx. The larynx is where we have our vocal cords. This portion of the larynx in blue in the anterior portion here, that is the thyroid cartilage. And if I turn to the side, here's that thyroid gland again. And this cartilage is called cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage. And those are the cartilages of the larynx. This is the heart. And you'll notice that the heart is off-centered. It's actually slightly off-centered towards the left side. It sits in between the lungs and a little bit nestled behind the lungs. Because the heart is off-centered towards the left, we actually see asymmetry between the right and left lungs. The left lung has the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. And that's it. There's just 2 lobes for the left lung. The right lung has 3 lobes. So the right lung has the superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. Underneath here is the right atrium. The right atrium. On the outside of the heart, we have this structure here, which looks somewhat like the outer portion of the ear. And for that reason, this portion is actually called the right auricle, just like the pinna or auricle of the ear, the right auricle. Underneath the right atrium, we have the right ventricle, the right ventricle. On this side, we have the left atrium and the left auricle and the left ventricle. So you might recall that deoxygenated blood coming from the head, neck, and arms go through the superior vena cava. So this is the superior vena cava. And the superior vena cava is created by the mergence of the right brachiocephalic vein and the left brachiocephalic vein. Brachio meaning arm, cephalic meaning head. Both of the right and left brachiocephalic veins have 2 branches that make it up. So this would be the jugular vein. This is the left jugular vein and the right jugular vein. This is the left subclavian vein, and this is the right subclavian vein. They're called subclavian because they travel underneath the clavicle. This is actually the clavicle here and here. All right, so deoxygenated blood comes from the right and left arms through the subclavian veins. So the jugular vein and subclavian merge to the brachiocephalic veins. It's the left brachiocephalic, right brachiocephalic. Right and left brachiocephalic veins merge together, forming the superior vena cava. Blood coming from the lower portions of the body, including the legs and the torso, are going to return to the heart through the inferior vena cava, which is here, the inferior vena cava. This here is the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary trunk. This is the aorta. So now I'm going to take off this front portion here. So blood is going to come from the left subclavian vein and right subclavian vein. They're going to merge with the left jugular vein and right jugular vein to form the right brachiocephalic vein and left brachiocephalic vein. The right and left brachiocephalic veins merge together to form the superior vena cava. That blood drains into the right atrium. Blood from the lower portions of the body enter the right atrium through the inferior vena cava. Once blood is here at the right atrium, it can then travel into the right ventricle, which is here. It travels from the atrium to the ventricle through the tricuspid valve, which is here. Now the tricuspid valve have these little strings on them. And if you guys ever heard the term, you're pulling on my heartstrings, this is actually where you get that saying from, because we actually do have strings. These strings are called the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae. Now, the chordae tendineae are going to be attached to muscles here called the papillary muscles. Now, what the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles do is they ensure that this valve opens in one direction but not the other. It's a one-way valve. So the valves prevent backflow of the blood so that blood flows in one direction through the heart. Once blood travels through the tricuspid valve and is in the right ventricle, I then get a contraction from the cardiac muscle or myocardium, and that's going to slam this door shut, and it's going to open the pulmonary semilunar valve here. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is going to be the opening to the pulmonary trunk. All right, this is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is an artery, blood vessel that's going away from the heart, yet it's colored blue because it is carrying deoxygenated blood. Here's the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to split off into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The right pulmonary artery is going to feed the right lung. The left pulmonary artery feeds the left lung. At that point, there is exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and now the blood is oxygenated. So oxygenated blood from the right lung is going to travel to the left atrium through the right pulmonary veins. Oxygenated blood from the left lung is going to travel to the left atrium through the left pulmonary veins. And these pulmonary veins are colored red because the blood is oxygenated in that blood vessel. Once the blood is here at the right atrium, it will then travel through the bicuspid valve, better known as the mitral valve. The mitral valve. Blood can then go through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve and enter into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is the most muscular and the largest chamber of the heart. When this contracts, the mitral valve is going to close. This is the aortic semilunar valve, or simply the aortic valve. The aortic valve is going to open, allowing for blood to enter into the aorta. The first branches of the aorta are actually going to be the right and left coronary arteries. The coronary arteries provide the blood supply to the tissue of the heart itself. When we look at the outside here, this here is the right coronary artery. This portion just right here before it splits, you'll see it splits right here, but just this portion right at this point, this is the left coronary artery. Now the left coronary artery is going to split right away. One branch is going to go in between the ventricles and is going to continue anteriorly. This artery is called the anterior interventricular artery. The other branch is going to circle around and continue to the back portion of the heart. This branch is called the circumflex artery. The circumflex artery. So if I continue to follow the circumflex artery around, that leads me to the back of the heart here. This vein here, this is called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus. This portion is considered the ascending aorta. The ascending aorta. Now, once I get to the point where I see these ascending branches, this is now considered the aortic arch. The aortic arch. Now, the aortic arch has 3 branches coming off of it. The first branch is the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is going to bifurcate or split to the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery, which you can just see a little bit of it here. Okay. The second branch, which you can see a little bit more of here, is the left common carotid artery, and that continues here. So, and the third branch is going to be the left subclavian artery. So this is the trachea, the trachea, the trachea. So here's the trachea. Behind the trachea, you have the esophagus. So here's more of the esophagus here. At this point here, the trachea splits. Trachea is going to split into the right and left primary bronchi. Bronchus would be singular, bronchi would be plural. So the right and left primary bronchi. So remember, this is the ascending aorta, the aortic arch. After the aortic arch, it's going to turn and descend. At that portion, generically, we call this the descending aorta. But I want you to be more specific than that. The portion of the descending aorta that is in the thoracic cavity is the thoracic aorta. Below the thoracic cavity, the aorta is going to continue to descend and become the abdominal aorta. And we'll see that a little bit when we peel more of this guy open. You might recall from the beginning of class that the diaphragm is physical separation of the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. The diaphragm is the principal muscle of respiration. When you are resting or asleep, your breathing should be governed almost completely by the diaphragm. When you're stressed or working out, that's when we start breathing from our intercostal muscles. So again, this is the diaphragm. This here is the liver. This is the stomach. This is small intestine. And in gray, this is the colon, otherwise known as the large intestine. So I'm going to remove the diaphragm now. And now I can see the liver. Now, the first thing you might notice with the liver is this blood vessel here. This is the inferior vena cava. If I flip this around, I can see more of the inferior vena cava. In green, this is the gallbladder, Now, the liver, the main thing that it does, it is going to create bile. And that bile is ultimately going to go to the duodenum, which is the first portion of the small intestine. What the gallbladder does is the gallbladder is going to take the bile that's made in the liver and it's going to store it and concentrate it. What it does is it waits until it gets a signal from the digestive system saying that there is fatty food coming down the pipes. when there's fatty food coming down, that triggers the release of this super concentrated bile, and it gives that 1-2 punch, right? So we get additional bile. What bile does is it's going to do what we call emulsifying fats. It cuts the fat up into smaller pieces, smaller oil bubbles, if you will, so that the other enzymes can then go around and get at the nutrients and break it down. Okay, so it's called an emulsification. Okay, so a couple other structures to know here. So this is the gallbladder, and this is the cystic duct. The cystic duct. Okay. So this is the hepatic duct. So this is how bile from the gallbladder and bile from the liver is going to travel outside of the liver. Okay, so hepatic duct, cystic duct. When they merge together, then we have what's called the common bile duct. The common bile duct. Okay. Now, the common bile duct is going to continue right here where it's green. Okay, let me move that a little bit. Sorry. Okay. So right here where it's green, the common bile duct is going to continue, and that common bile duct is going to enter into this structure here called the pancreas. Okay. The pancreas, in addition to having the bile and everything from the gallbladder and the liver, it also makes pancreatic enzymes. Okay, so we've got pancreatic enzymes and bile, and all of that is going to go to the first portion of the small intestine, which is here at the duodenum. All right. Okay, so here we have our esophagus, and food is going to come down the esophagus, and it is going to go through a valve in order to enter the stomach. So I could ask you about this valve at this location or at this location. Okay, both of these are the cardiac valve, also known as the cardiac sphincter. Either one is okay. Now, the reason it's called the cardiac valve or the cardiac sphincter is because if this is all articulated, you'll notice that it's close to the heart. The heart sits right here. Okay. So food is going to enter the stomach through the cardiac sphincter. In addition, I have another sphincter or valve that food must exit the stomach from, and that is here and here. So I could ask you that in either way. Okay, and this is called the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. All right, so here are some structures of the stomach itself that you need to know. Oops. All right, so now I have the stomach open. And here is that cardiac valve. Now, on Thanksgiving, if you eat too much food or spicy food, or if you're just genetically disposed to having heartburn, what can happen is the cardiac valve will not close correctly, will not close all the way. When that happens, we get acid reflux or heartburn. And the stomach acid, which is hydrochloric acid, is actually going to go up and back into the esophagus. Now, the esophagus does not have the structure to combat the hydrochloric acid of the stomach. Okay, so that will burn this and can actually cause damage. Okay, so this is the cardiac valve. The area around the cardiac valve is called the cardiac region of the stomach. the cardiac region of the stomach. This bulge here is called the fundus or the fundic region of the stomach. The main area of the stomach here is called the body of the stomach. And as I approach the pyloric valve here, this would be the pyloric region of the stomach. The last structure you need to know are these ridges. These ridges are called rugae. That's R-U-G-A-E, the rugae. And they allow for expansion of the stomach. Okay, the rugae. All right, so you can see if this is, oops. So if this was articulated, you would see that this is the exit. All right, so this is the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. Now, the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter is going to open when the stomach senses that the, do you remember that food is called bolus? Okay. The moistened food is called a bolus when you swallow it because it's moistened enough to swallow. That bolus, once it enters the stomach, starts to undergo processing. Okay, it undergoes processing until it becomes a new substance called chyme. That's C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. Until it gets to that right consistency of being broken down in the stomach, this remains closed. So this is going to open only when it senses that it's at that right consistency, in which we call chyme. All right? So when it's ready, this is going to open, and food is then going to begin to enter the first portion of the small intestine. Okay. The first portion of the small intestine has 3 portions. The first portion is the duodenum. It is the smallest, or I should say the shortest portion of the small intestine. The second is going to be the jejunum, and the third is the ileum. So there's 3 sections of the small intestine. Now here at the duodenum is where most of the digestion of the food is going to take place. Okay, let me say that again. It's at the duodenum where most digestion is going to take place. Now the reason for that is because this is now chyme, but this chyme is now going to get pancreatic juice or pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas, and they're going to drain directly into the duodenum. In addition, the bile from the gallbladder and the liver are also going to drain here into the duodenum. So because of the bile and because of the pancreatic enzymes or pancreatic juice, we're going to have most of the digestion occurring in just this area here. Okay, any questions about that before I go on? Couple peripheral things I'm going to just share with you before I continue on, because I am going to have to kind of hide these things for a moment. So this structure here is the spleen. Okay, so this is the spleen. All right, this is the right kidney, and this is a portion of the left kidney, and can't really tell, it's really dark. Okay, and then there's the rest of the left kidney. Okay, so there's the left kidney there. There we go. All right, so here is the duodenum. Now what the kidneys do is the kidneys are going to make urine. Urine from the kidneys is going to travel to the bladder. So this is the bladder, sometimes referred to as the urinary bladder, to be more specific. And how it gets from the kidneys to the bladder is through the ureters. So this is the right ureter and the left ureter. Okay. And there's the urinary bladder. The abdominal aorta, you can only see a little tiny bit of it here. It's going to continue behind these, and then it's going to split and no longer be the aorta once it gets to that point. If you're interested, this is the right and left iliac arteries and right and left iliac veins. Okay. And you might remember this is actually, I just realized, this is the iliac crest of the hip bones here. Okay, so that's why these are called the ileum, because you might remember you've got the ischium, the pubis, and the ileum are the three bones that make up the hip bones. So for that reason, we call these iliac. Okay. Okay. So once food is moving through the duodenum, so this is the duodenum, the first portion of the small intestine. After that, it's going to go through the jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine. Now, the jejunum is going to be most of this yellowish area here. On this side and on the top of this. So if I'm asking for the ileum, I'm going to make it really, I'm sorry, if I'm asking for the jejunum, I'm going to make it really clear, and I'm going to put it like over here. Okay, so the jejunum is the first portion of, or I'm sorry, the jejunum is the second portion of the small intestine, but it's the portion over here of this mass. Now, most of the absorption of the food, absorption of the nutrients, occurs mostly in the jejunum of the small intestine. Okay, so that's where absorption of nutrients really occurs. Now, there's no physical separation between the jejunum of the small intestine and the ileum of the small intestine, but the ileum of the small intestine is going to be around this structure here. Okay. So in order for food to go from the ileum to the large intestine or colon, it has to go through a valve, and that valve is called the ileocecal valve. Ileocecal valve. Okay. Ileo because it's the ileum of the small intestine, and ceco because this first portion of the colon or large intestine is called the cecum, and that's C-E-C-U-M, the cecum. Okay. It's another structure that's hiding back here. On the back portion of the cecum, I have this little tail here. This is the appendix. The appendix. Now, the appendix was thought for a long time to be just what we call a vestigial organ, meaning that it has no use whatsoever anymore. But now we're kind of thinking that this has some probiotics that might be important for the digestive system. We used to say that this used to create enzymes for digesting cellulose in grass. Now, if you were to eat a piece of grass and not chop it up in a blender, it would come out the exact same way it came in. It would be undigested. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute. I've gone to the health store, I've read my juice, and it says it has wheatgrass in it. And it does. But the thing is, they've digested it for you by putting it in a blender. Okay, so if you go to Jamba Juice and you get a wheatgrass shot, they're going to blend the heck out of it. So you're able to get at the nutrients. But if we just ate grass, it's nothing but roughage. It's just going to come out the same way. But we used to think that, we think that the appendix had enzymes that broke down cellulose, but we've lost them over time. Okay. All right, so I'm actually going to take this off again so you can see it. All right, so after the cecum, I'm going to have the, it's no longer called chyme at this point. Once it's been processed through all of the small intestine, we actually call it a different type of substance called chyle, C-H-Y-L-E. Okay, so the chyle is going to travel through the colon here. That's in gray. And the colon has different regions. The first region is the cecum. This portion is the ascending colon. The ascending colon. Here on top, this is the transverse colon. The transverse colon. And then the descending colon. Now, once I get to about here, it's going to continue on the model here. Okay. And this is still part of the large intestine or colon, and this portion is called the sigmoid colon. It's called the sigmoid because it makes kind of this weird S shape. Now, sometimes doctors will do a full colonoscopy and look at all of the colon. Other times they might just order a sigmoidoscopy. And in that case, they're only looking at this more accessible, that curvature, the sigmoid colon. Okay? And that is everything that you need to know for this model. Easy, right? Okay, totally, yeah. All right. Since it's going to take me a minute to get this guy back together, let's do a short break. Let's do 15 minutes. We might actually do 2 breaks because I'll need to put the other one together too. So let's continue at 1:15 and we'll go over another model. I won't be as descriptive because you've already kind of learned some of the functioning of these. So next one should go a little quicker. Does anyone want to take any pictures of this before I put this guy together?
Yes.
Okay, cool. You know what I'll do? Let me put this on the side, and then you guys can have plenty of time with it, so you're not rushed. And you can even play with it and put it like together. And
Yeah, having the photos makes like a really big difference.
Yeah.
I found like for the studying, because this is like exactly what you're seeing.
Yeah. So I'm going to put all the pieces over here too, so you can take more. And you can like, it's kind of fun to put these together and take pictures at different levels. Alright. Here is our other torso model. So we're going to start at the top, work our way down. So here is the parotid gland, which is one of your salivary glands. And then on this side, we have the submandibular gland. And then here under the tongue, we have the sublingual gland. All 3 of those are salivary glands. Here we get a good look of the hyoid bone. So there's the hyoid bone. From here to here, this portion of the airways is called the larynx, and that has your vocal cords, and it leads to the trachea, which we see down here. This gland here is the thyroid gland. This cartilage over the larynx is called the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage. The cartilage, once we get further back, changes its name to cricoid cartilage. So that's the cricoid cartilage. Down here, once we start getting into the cartilaginous rings, we are at the trachea. So this is the trachea, and these blue things are the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. The heart sits a little bit towards the left side. For that reason, the left lung is smaller and it has only two lobes. It has the superior lobe, and the inferior lobe, whereas the right lung has the superior, middle, and inferior lobes. In this model, the diaphragm is here. So this is the diaphragm. Now I could also take these off and ask for the diaphragm here. Okay, so that would be the diaphragm. This is the left subclavian vein and the right subclavian vein. They're taking blood from the arms. I've got the left jugular vein and right jugular vein taking blood from the head, neck, and brain. The jugular vein and the subclavian veins come together to form, this one would be the left brachiocephalic vein and the right brachiocephalic vein. The right and left brachiocephalic veins merge together to form the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava. I also have the inferior vena cava, which I'll have to show you after I take this off because it's kind of hidden back here. But both the inferior and superior vena cava are going to drain into the right atrium. Okay, under here is the right atrium. This structure here is called the right auricle. This portion under here is going to be the right ventricle. Then here is the left atrium and the left auricle and the left ventricle here. All right, so let's take this apart. So here is that inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. So both the inferior and superior vena cava are going to drain here into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood is going to travel through the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is attached to the choroid tendini, which are attached to the papillary muscles that are going to ensure that this opens only when it's supposed to, and that it opens in one direction. When the ventricle contracts, blood will be pushed up through the pulmonary semilunar valve here and enter into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to split into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Okay, then it goes to the lungs, blood gets oxygenated and returns to the heart, and it's going to return to the heart through the right and left pulmonary veins. Okay, the right and left pulmonary veins are going to drain into the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood travels through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve and enters into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then contracts, pushing blood up through the aortic semilunar valve. From there, blood will enter into the ascending aorta. The ascending aorta. If you look very closely, you can see the first branches of the ascending aorta. One is here, that would be the left coronary artery, and here is the branch for the right coronary artery. The right coronary artery continues, and you can see that's continuation here on the outside of the heart. So that's the right coronary artery. And the left coronary artery is right here. The left coronary artery is going to split into the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. And the other thing you need to know here is the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus. This portion of the aorta is considered the ascending aorta. Once I get to the point where I have the branches off of the aorta, that point is the aortic arch. The first branch of the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is going to bifurcate or split, forming the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. The second branch is going to be the left common carotid artery. And the third and final branch is going to be the left subclavian artery, which is here, the left subclavian artery. So remember, here is the trachea and the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. The trachea continues here. The trachea is going to bifurcate into the right and left primary bronchi. This is the esophagus again, and this is the thoracic portion of the descending aorta. And remember, this portion here is the diaphragm. We also saw part of the diaphragm on the base of the lung, like so. Here we see the liver. This is the stomach. Here we see the small intestines and the large intestines, or colon. So let's take out the liver. Turning the liver around, here we see the inferior vena cava. So this is the inferior vena cava. This is the gallbladder in this model, the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is going to drain its concentrated bile through the cystic duct. Next we have the stomach, and we can see here that this is the esophagus. Now the opening, the connection between the esophagus and the stomach is going to be the cardiac sphincter or the cardiac valve. So this is the cardiac sphincter or cardiac valve. This is also the cardiac sphincter or cardiac valve. And the exit to the stomach, so that is the pyloric valve or the pyloric sphincter. Or I could ask you about the fundic region, which is going to be here. The cardiac region is going to be in this area. Body region is going to be here. And the pyloric region will be here. This is the pancreas. The pancreas. This is your spleen. And this is the other end of that pyloric valve. The first portion of the small intestine is here, and that's called the duodenum. The duodenum. If I turn it around, I can see more of the duodenum. After the duodenum, we get the jejunum. Much of the jejunum is behind this here. After the jejunum, we get to the ileum. After the ileum, then we start to enter into the large intestines. If I open this little thing here, this area is the cecum of the large intestine or colon. That is the cecum. If I turn this around, I can see this structure called the appendix. The colon has several regions. This first portion here is the cecum. This would be the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon is shown here on this model. The sigmoid colon continues here until it straightens out about here. Once it straightens out, at that point we call it the rectum. This is the right kidney and this is the left kidney. At the top of both of the kidneys, these are the adrenal glands. This here is the abdominal aorta. The right and left iliac veins merge together to form the inferior vena cava here. Blood vessels going to each of the kidneys. This is the renal vein and the renal artery. Renal vein, renal artery. Urine is formed in the kidneys and then is going to go to the urinary bladder down here, and it's going to travel through the ureters. So here's the ureter and here is the other ureter. Here we have the right atrium. This is the right auricle. Underneath here, the right ventricle. Here is the left atrium, the left auricle, and the left ventricle. Deoxygenated blood from the right side of the head, neck, brain, and the right arm are going to travel through the right brachiocephalic vein here. Deoxygenated blood from the left arm and left side of the head and neck are going to travel through the left brachiocephalic vein. The right and left brachiocephalic veins merge to form the superior vena cava. Down here we have the inferior vena cava. Both the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava drain into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood travels through the tricuspid valve here. Here's a better view of that tricuspid valve. So here's the tricuspid valve. Here are the chordae tendini, and they're connected to the papillary muscles. Blood travels through the tricuspid valve and enters into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood travels through the pulmonary semilunar valve and enters the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to bifurcate into the right and left pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary arteries. From there, blood goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, and then returns to the heart. That oxygenated blood from the right lung is going to return to the heart through the right pulmonary veins. Oxygenated blood from the left lung returns to the heart through the left pulmonary veins. Both the right and left pulmonary veins are going to drain into the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood travels through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve here. These are the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles. Once blood gets here, it's at the left ventricle. So that is the aortic semilunar valve. From there, blood enters the ascending aorta. Okay, we see part of the ascending aorta here. The first branches that we see come off of the ascending aorta. And the ascending aorta branches off, forming the right and left coronary arteries. This is the right coronary artery here, the left coronary artery, the anterior interventricular artery, the circumflex artery. Here's a better view of that inferior vena cava. And here is the coronary sinus here in blue. So here is the ascending aorta. This is the aortic arch here, and that continues to descend, forming the thoracic aorta. The first branch off of the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic trunk. The second is going to be the left common carotid artery, and the third is the left subclavian artery. Okay, any questions about that one? So you have two large heart models and one small heart model. Underneath here, this is the right atrium, This area here is the right auricle. Underneath here is the right ventricle. This is the left atrium, the left auricle, and the left ventricle here. Deoxygenated blood are going to enter the right atrium, which is here. From the lower parts of the body, it's going to enter there through the inferior vena cava. From the upper portions of the body, it enters through the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is formed by the right and left brachiocephalic veins. Once blood gets into the right atrium, it can then travel to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve also has these strings, which are the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are attached to the papillary muscles here. When blood enters the right ventricle, the heart contracts, pushing blood up through the pulmonary semilunar valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve then opens, allowing blood to enter the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to split off into the right and left pulmonary arteries. From there, blood becomes oxygenated and then needs to return to the heart. It's going to return to the heart at the left atrium. Blood returns to the heart at the left atrium through the left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins. Once blood is here, it'll then travel through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve. These are the chordae tendineae of the mitral valve. Those are connected to the papillary muscles down here. From here, blood will travel through the aortic semilunar valve, which is hidden here. From there, blood is going to enter into the ascending aorta, which is here. The first branches of the ascending aorta are the right and left coronary arteries. This is the right coronary artery, and just right here is the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery is going to split, forming the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. The circumflex artery continues going around towards the posterior portion of the heart, and here in blue we have the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus. This portion of the aorta is the ascending aorta. This portion is the aortic arch. This is the aortic arch. This first branch here is the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, the brachiocephalic trunk. This is the left common carotid artery, and the third branch is going to be the left subclavian artery. After the aortic arch, the aorta will continue to descend as the descending aorta, more specifically this portion which goes through the thoracic cavity is called the thoracic aorta. This is actually the esophagus here, and this is part of the trachea. And you can see more of the trachea and the cartilaginous rings here. The trachea bifurcates or splits, forming the right and left primary bronchi. We actually have a structure here that as an adult has no function. This is actually a remnant from fetal circulation. So in the fetus we have a bridge that goes directly from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So in the fetus, the entire pulmonary circuit is bypassed. So this is our small heart model. Let's go over some of the features here in the front. So this is the right atrium, the right auricle. This would be the right ventricle under here. The left atrium, left auricle, and left ventricle. Deoxygenated blood from the head, neck, and arms is going to enter the heart through the superior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood from the lower portions of the body, including the torso and the legs, enters the heart through the inferior vena cava. Both the superior and inferior vena cava drain into the right atrium here. From the right atrium, blood travels through the tricuspid valve here. Here I have the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. This is the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, blood will be pushed up through the pulmonary semilunar valve. From there, blood enters the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk bifurcates, forming the left and right pulmonary arteries. From there, blood goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, returns to the heart through the right and left pulmonary veins. Both the right and left pulmonary veins drain into the left atrium. Okay, from the left atrium, blood travels through the bicuspid or mitral valve. The mitral valve has chordae tendineae here, and that's connected to the papillary muscles down here. Blood is then pushed up through the aortic semilunar valve here, the aortic semilunar valve, and then it enters the ascending aorta. So this is the ascending aorta here. In this model, you can see the branches. This is actually the beginning of the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. So in this model, those coronary arteries continue to go on the outside. This is that right coronary artery here. The left coronary artery splits, becoming the anterior interventricular artery here, and it continues here as the circumflex. The other branch is going to be the circumflex artery here. And then here is the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus. Let me first let you know what it is we are looking at here. So this is a kidney that has been cut in half. There is a portion of the kidney that you see here that's in yellow with these tubules. This section here has been cut out and zoomed in at this panel here. So this is this structure here called the nephron, and it's blown up. This is a renal corpuscle, so is this and this. If I were to take one of the renal corpuscles and cut that open, then I would get this opened half of a renal corpuscle here. We're going to start with the kidney and work our way around. This portion here that you see in brown, and if we were able to turn it around, you'd see more brown. This is the renal capsule. The renal capsule. It surrounds the kidney. This outer portion of the kidney is called the renal cortex. The renal cortex. If I go deeper, now I get to these structures here called the renal pyramids. And this level or this layer is called the renal medulla. The renal medulla. Once I get to this area here, this area is referred to as the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis. So we've got the capsule, the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis. And those would be the layers. So let's first look at how blood flows in the kidney. Oxygenated blood from the heart is going to exit the heart through the aorta. Blood's going to go through the ascending aorta, through the aortic arch, and then down to the thoracic aorta. So the thoracic aorta is going to branch off to form this renal artery here. Now the renal artery is going to split, forming what we call the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries. The segmental arteries are going to bifurcate or split once again, forming an interlobar artery. Interlobar artery. And it's called an interlobar because one of the pyramids along with its cortex is considered a lobe. So that would be a lobe. This would be a lobe. So this is the interlobar artery. After that, the interlobar artery is going to start moving transversely, and this makes up the arcuate artery. The arcuate artery. Now I have branches off of the arcuate artery, and these are called the interlobular arteries or cortical radiate arteries. Cortical radiate arteries. Once I'm at the cortical radiate arteries, at that point I can enter into what we call the nephron, and this is one view of the nephron here. So I'm going to switch over to here so we can get a better view. This is the arcuate artery. This is the cortical radiate artery. I have an artery that comes into the renal corpuscle. That artery is called the afferent arteriole. Afferent arteriole. Once blood goes into the afferent arteriole, that blood begins to be filtered here. And it's going to be separated into portions that are going to go through the renal tubules here to form urine or return to the blood supply of the body. The portion of blood that returns to the circulatory system is going to return through the efferent arteriole. Okay, so afferent arteriole goes in, efferent goes out. All right, so the efferent arteriole. After that, we're going to get to the interlobular veins or cortico-radiant veins. From there, we go to the arcuate vein. And then if I go back here, I can see the arcuate veins are going to drain into the interlobar veins, and the interlobar veins are going to merge together to form the renal vein. Now you'll notice the only difference between the pathways is the veins don't have a segmental vein. So now that I've talked about the blood circulation, let's go into more detail on the formation of urine. So if we zoom into the nephron, we're going to see this here. Now, this is a renal corpuscle, and this whole thing is a renal corpuscle. I've got the Bowman's capsule, which is this outer portion here, Bowman's capsule, and then all of this here in pink is the glomerulus, And I have this web of cells that are actually going to cover the glomerulus. Those are called podocytes, or foot cells, podocytes. This is the proximal tubule, right? This is the distal tubule. Here at 1 is the afferent, so this would be the afferent arteriole, and this would be the efferent arteriole. So the precursor to urine is now going to leave the renal corpuscle and travel through all of this here. Now collectively, all of these tubules here are considered renal tubules, but they have different areas. This first portion here, where it has all these convolutions, is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule. This entire loop here is called the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle. This portion is the descending arm of the loop of Henle, and this is the ascending arm of the loop of Henle. As I follow the ascending arm of the loop of Henle upward, I get to another mess of convoluted tubes. This is the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule. At this point, the distal convoluted tubules from a bunch of different nephrons are going to empty into what we call the collecting duct. The collecting duct, which is here. And just to help with the orientation, this entire outer portion is renal cortex. And then at B, this would be the outer renal medulla. And at C, we have the inner renal medulla. So if we go back here we can see a collecting duct. So the collecting duct is going to travel through a renal pyramid and come to the apex of the renal pyramid. So this tip of the renal pyramid is called the papilla, or renal papilla. The renal papilla houses a little duct here called the papillary duct. The papillary duct. And the papillary duct drains into these cup-like structures here. These structures are called minor calyces. Each one of these is considered a calyx. So its calyx is singular. When I have two minor calyces coming together, they merge to form a major calyx. A major calyx. And again, this is called the renal pelvis here. And then urine will finally leave the kidney through the ureter, which we see here, the ureter. All right, so let's start with this view of the kidney. This outer portion is the renal capsule, the renal capsule. Now there's one structure I can show you here that was not visible in the other model. This, at number 5, is the renal hilum, sometimes called hilus, renal hilus. All right, turning this guy around. So this is the renal capsule. The outer portion is the renal cortex. Here where I have the renal pyramids, I have the renal medulla, Once I start getting to the blood vessels and nerves down here, this is called the renal pelvis, So looking at some of the structures here, blood is going to leave the heart through the aorta. That blood's going to continue to go down the thoracic aorta and branch off at the renal artery here. The renal artery is going to branch to make segmental arteries. The segmental arteries. Segmental arteries are then going to branch off, forming the interlobar arteries. Then they're going to start going transversely, forming the arcuate arteries. From there, we then get the cortical radiant arteries, also sometimes called the interlobular arteries. From there, blood is then able to go into the renal corpuscles. Each of the renal corpuscles has two parts. It's got the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule. The interlobular arteries, or cortical radiant arteries, have little branches off of them called afferent arterioles. Each afferent arteriole goes to a renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is going to start the process of making urine. The urine is going to go from here to the proximal convoluted tubule, and then you've got the loop of Henle, which really isn't shown on these, and then the distal convoluted tubule, and then to the collecting duct. From the collecting duct, it will then go to the minor calyces. This portion of the collecting duct is going to go through the tip here of the renal pyramid, and that is the papillary duct. And this area of the renal pyramid is the papilla. Urine is then going to go into this little cup structure and go into the minor calyces. Minor calyces merge, forming the major calyces, or major calyx. This area right here is the renal pelvis, and then urine is going to finally exit the kidney through the ureter here. Blood that's returning to circulation is going to exit the renal corpuscle through the efferent arteriole. From the efferent arteriole, that blood is then going to go through the interlobular veins, or the cortical radiant veins, to the arcuate veins running transversely, then interlobar veins, and then the interlobar veins merge to form the renal vein. And the renal vein drains into the inferior vena cava, which leads directly to the heart. Here's the kidney. Now there's one structure on this model that you didn't see on the other models, and that's this structure here. This is the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland. Now the adrenal gland does a lot of things, actually makes a lot of hormones, but so your stress response is going to be dictated by the release of cortisol here at the adrenal gland. This outer portion of the kidney is the renal capsule. The renal capsule. Here, from this outer view, I can see renal artery, renal vein, and the ureter. The ureter. So the outer portion again is the cortex, the renal cortex, where I have these structures, which are the renal pyramids. This is the renal medulla. And then here, this whole area is the renal pelvis. On this one, I can see the renal pyramids. The renal pyramids. I have space between the renal pyramids, which are the renal columns. They're real pronounced in this one. The renal pyramids are going to drain into the minor calyces. Minor calyces merge together, forming major calyces. And that's pretty much all you can see on this one. It's not a whole lot. So this is the respiratory system model. So this structure here is the tongue. This is the mandible. These would be lips. And this is the oral cavity. The oral cavity here. This is the nasal cavity. These are the nasal concha. Okay, this is the inferior, middle, and superior nasal concha. Once I get to here at number 2, this is the beginning of the pharynx. The pharynx is the word for throat. Now the pharynx has 3 regions though, so this portion of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx. The portion of the pharynx that lies posterior to the oral cavity is the oropharynx. The oropharynx. This portion here, and here, all of this before we get to the trachea, this is called the larynx. The larynx. So for that reason, the portion of the pharynx here is called the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx. When you swallow, this structure here, called the epiglottis, is going to fold down and block off the airways. Okay, so that food is directed down into the esophagus here. This entire airway here is called the larynx. Here is where we have the vocal folds, and the vocal cords are all here. And the area just around the vocal cords is often referred to as the glottis. It's called the glottis. I have some cartilage that is around the larynx. In front here, I've got the thyroid cartilage. Below the thyroid cartilage and here posteriorly, both of these are called cricoid cartilage. So air is going to move down the larynx and get into the trachea. So once I start to see these rings, at this point I'm at the trachea. Each of these rings are called the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. Now the trachea is going to bifurcate or split into the right and left primary bronchi. Bronchi would be plural, bronchus is singular. Now, both of these are going to branch, but we have only the view of the right lung being opened. I do wanted to remind you that the right lung has 3 lobes. It's got the superior, middle, and inferior lobes, and the left lung's only going to have the superior lobe and inferior lobe. Here's the trachea. Trachea is going to branch off into the left primary bronchus and right primary bronchus. From the right primary bronchus, you can then see another split, and this gives rise to the secondary bronchi. All right, the secondary bronchi are then going to split again to the tertiary bronchi and so on. So I'm going to continue to get more and more splits until I get down to the very fine airways, which we call the bronchioles. The bronchioles continue to get smaller and smaller until we get to the smallest type of bronchiole, which is shown here. So this would be a terminal bronchiole. Terminal bronchioles are going to end in an alveolar duct, which we see one open up here. Okay, an alveolar duct, and the alveolar ducts are going to end at alveolar sacs. And alveolar sacs are where we are going to have exchange of gases between the blood and the respiratory system. In this, each one of these is a single alveolus or pulmonary alveolus. Even though they're only showing the capillary beds here, just know the capillary beds are on top of each of the pulmonary alveoli. These capillary beds are what is going to allow exchange of gases between the circulatory and respiratory systems. So this is a larynx model, but it also has some additional features of the digestive system on it. So let's just show you what you need to know for the practical exam. So this structure here is the tongue. Okay, this is the tongue. These are the teeth, and this is the mandible. Now, one of the things that we have here is we can see 2 of the 3 salivary glands. Now, the 3rd salivary gland is not shown here, and that is the parotid gland, which lies outside of the cheek. And you can see those on the torso models. I do see the other 2 salivary glands on here, though. This one is the submandibular gland, because it lies under the mandible. And this one lies under the tongue, so this is the sublingual gland. Another structure I'd like to point out is the hyoid. Okay, this is the hyoid bone here. The top of this structure here is the epiglottis. This is that flap that is going to close the airways upon swallowing. This hole here that's kind of created when these 2 are together, this whole area is the glottis, and you might recall the glottis is where we've got our vocal cords, vocal folds, that sort of thing. We also can see the thyroid gland. All right, from the front view, starting here to where I start to get to the cartilaginous rings, this whole region is called the larynx. The cartilage here is the thyroid cartilage. This here is cricoid cartilage. So this is cricoid cartilage, and in the back here is going to be cricoid cartilage as well. Once I get to this point, this is the trachea, And each one of these is a cartilaginous ring of the trachea. All right, so this is the tongue again. This here is the epiglottis. So I can see a lot more of the epiglottis here. Before I could just see this little point. This cavity here is called the glottis. The glottis. And I've got the vocal folds and vocal cords that are going to be here. This is thyroid cartilage. This is cricoid cartilage. And this is cricoid cartilage. From this level downward or inferiorly, I've got the trachea. And each one of these cartilaginous rings is a cartilaginous ring of the trachea. This model, there's a lot of different things that I could ask you on this model. So I'm going to start at the top and kind of work my way down. So this is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone. From this structure here to here, this whole structure is called the larynx. The larynx. This gland is the thyroid gland that you see here. The thyroid gland. This is the thyroid cartilage. And this is cricoid cartilage. Once I get here, I'm at the trachea, and these in blue are the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. Here we have the hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and here in the back, cricoid cartilage. This is the trachea and the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. The other side shows the thyroid gland. Posteriorly, I can see this top portion is the epiglottis, and the hole or cavity created here is the glottis. Opening the structure up, I can see the whole thing is the larynx up to here. This is the epiglottis. This is the vocal folds and vocal cords here. This is the thyroid cartilage. So this one you can see the thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and cricoid cartilage. And the other one, the cricoid cartilage here, was obscured by the gland. Okay, and then again, this whole area here is the glottis, and it has the vocal cords and vocal folds there. Here I can see a continuation of the trachea and the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. This is the heart. We can see the heart sits slightly off towards the left side. For this reason, the left lung is only going to have 2 lobes, whereas the right lung has 3. This would be the superior lobe of the left lung and the inferior lobe of the left lung. On the right lung, superior lobe of the right lung, the middle lobe of the right lung, and then here is the inferior lobe of the right lung. At the base of the lungs, you see this muscular tissue. This muscular tissue is the diaphragm, and it's the principal muscle for respiration. Here you can see a better view of the diaphragm. All right, removing the lungs exposes the heart. Underneath this structure here is going to be the right atrium. Under here is the right ventricle. Under here is the left atrium and the left ventricle. On the outside, this ear-like structure is going to be the right auricle. And similarly on the left, this is the left auricle. This vein here is going to take deoxygenated blood from the right arm. Okay, so this is the right subclavian vein. This is the right jugular vein. So the subclavian vein and jugular vein are going to merge together to form the right brachiocephalic vein. On the left side of the body, I'm going to have the left subclavian vein and the left jugular vein here. Those are going to merge together to form the left brachiocephalic vein. The right and left brachiocephalic veins are going to merge together to form the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava. Down here, I have the inferior vena cava. Also, if I were to just look at the heart itself, this is the inferior vena cava, and so is this. Deoxygenated blood from the lower portions of the body are going to enter the right atrium through the inferior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood from the upper portions of the body is going to enter the right atrium through the superior vena cava. The right atrium is here, and this is the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve. I have these strings that are attached to the valve, and these are called the chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are attached to papillary muscles that ensure that the valve only opens in one direction and not the other. This chamber here is the right ventricle. The right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is going to exit the heart through the pulmonary semilunar valve here. The pulmonary semilunar valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve is going to go to the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk. Now, the pulmonary trunk is going to bifurcate or split, forming the right pulmonary artery and left pulmonary artery. Blood is going to become oxygenated and then return to the heart. How it returns to the heart is through these structures here. So these are the right pulmonary veins and left pulmonary veins. So both the right and left pulmonary veins are going to drain blood into the left atrium, which is here, the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood goes through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve. It's kind of dead here. Okay, the little strings are the chordae tendineae. So yeah, this is kind of broken, so sorry about that. So the strings are the chordae tendineae. They're attached to the papillary muscles. This chamber here is the left ventricle, the left ventricle. From there, blood is going to travel through the aortic semilunar valve. The aortic semilunar valve allows blood to leave the heart and enter into the aorta. Just this portion of the aorta that's shown here is the ascending aorta, and I can see more of the ascending aorta here. If I look very closely, I can see there's two branches that are coming off of the aorta. This is the right coronary artery, and here is the left coronary artery. The coronary arteries are going to give blood supply to the heart itself. Now that I have the heart back together, we can continue to trace the right and left coronary arteries. Here is the right coronary artery continuing. The left coronary artery in this model splits immediately. So the left coronary artery is going to split, forming the anterior interventricular artery, which is here, and the circumflex artery, which is here. If I follow the circumflex artery around, I'm going to get to this very large vein here called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus. This also gives you a better view of that inferior vena cava as well. For blood supply going to the body in the systemic circuit, that blood's going to go up into the ascending aorta and then arrive at the aortic arch. The aortic arch has three branches that are coming off of it superiorly. This first branch is the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is going to bifurcate or split into the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. The second branch is going to be the left common carotid artery, and I can see that continuing here. The third and final branch off of the aortic arch is the left subclavian artery. The left subclavian artery. Now, if I remove the heart, I can see some additional structures here. After the ascending aorta, we have the aortic arch. After the aortic arch, it's going to turn and the aorta is going to descend as the descending aorta. I want you to be more specific though. The portion of the descending aorta that goes through the thoracic cavity is going to be the thoracic aorta. So I can see the thoracic aorta here. Once the thoracic aorta goes through the diaphragm, which I see here, it's then going to be called the abdominal aorta. The abdominal aorta, and I can see part of that here. This structure here is the esophagus. The esophagus. The esophagus is also going to travel through the diaphragm and then connect with the stomach. I can now see more of the trachea exposed. So this is the trachea. The trachea is going to bifurcate. It actually bifurcates into the right and left primary bronchi, sometimes called the main bronchi, but I think primary is a little bit more used. So that would be primary bronchi here. And because I have 3 lobes in the right lung, I'm actually going to get 3 separate secondary bronchi. So, and then the secondary bronchi are going to branch to tertiary bronchi and so on and so forth, getting to the tiny bronchioles. Now the left lung only has 2 lobes, so for that reason, the primary bronchus is just going to split off into 2 secondary bronchi here. And then I can see more branching of the bronchi. Now I've got tertiary bronchi, etc., till I get to the small, fine bronchioles.